The ring caught the light like a drop of blue water on steel sitting alone on an evidence tray under the hum of the lab's fluorescent panel. No dust in the creases, no scar from time, just that ice-cold shine staring back at me, something too clean in a case that was nothing but grit. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I keep a little office on the second floor of the old brick courthouse 2 doors down from records and across from a coffee machine that rattles like it's held together by prayer. On quiet mornings in Cedar Ridge, I'd crack the blinds around 7, let the desert light pour across my desk and listen to the county wake-up trucks shifting through second gear on main bakery doors, opening with that soft thump and the whistle of wind coming off the mesas like a slow exhale. This town runs on habit. Folks rise early, sweep their porches, and swap news at the feed and supply as if the day won't start without a story told face to face. That spring sat warm on the skin, high 70s by afternoon, crisp at dawn, with a sweetness in the air from creosote after the last light rain. I'd drive the long way in past the old water tower and the community center where Tom Fletcher still came by at 8 sharp keys on a lanyard unlocking rooms like ritual. He'd wave from the curb 2 fingers off the brim of a sun-faded cap. Tom spent his Fridays painting trim, no one asked him to paint, and oiling doors that squeaked even after the oil. In a place like this, that's how people love quiet and useful. The Winters place sat on a rise to the north past a mile of washboard road that never seemed to settle. Their glass and stucco build looked like a showroom set down in dust-stone columns, a driveway long enough for a parade and a gate that clicked shut like a final word. I'd pass it on patrol now and then, a habit more than a need, and the lawn kept green in a desert that doesn't forgive would shimmer as the sprinklers threw arcs of water into air that swallowed them whole. Most mornings, Beatrice's white SUV sat under the carport clean even after a windstorm, and the porch light was always off by 6, a clockwork kind of precision. I met Jose and Maria Martinez the way I meet most good people when something unfair had already happened. The first time he took his hat off before he sat in my chair. She pressed a folded clinic invoice flat with the heel of her hand, calm as a person who's had to be calm for too long. They spoke in plain sentences, just the facts, payments, receipts, the date. A notice had been pinned to their fence like a warning from a stranger. When they left, I walked them to the stairs. It was a small thing, but people deserve ceremony when they've been pushed around. On Thursdays, I'd swing by the community center around dusk to check doors and linger a minute in the gym where bingo nights drew the kind of laughter that settles your shoulders. Paper numbers would flap off tables in the ceiling fan's breeze, and Tom would crisscross the floor peeling tape from last week's lines, careful not to scuff. I'd stand there and let the sound take me back to a time when Cedar Ridge didn't need quite as much protecting back before money and the people who wield it without mercy learned how easy it is to bend a small town if you keep smiling while you do it. Most folks had their opinion about Harold Winters. Mine came by way of yellow envelopes and heavy binders. I've watched men like him all my career tidy papers mean edges. The day he advised 6 families into loans that weren't loans at all, I started a wall file with his name on it, a thin folder that thickened like bad weather over a wheat field. He walked Main Street as if the sidewalk had signed a contract to hold him. Polite in public, sharp in private, no profanity, no shouting, just statements delivered so smoothly you almost missed what they took from you. Beatrice was different but not gentler. Her clinic sat behind tinted glass and a brushed metal sign as clinical as a bank. She ran it like cash drawers run a register count it twice, give nothing that can't be billed. When I stood beside Maria on that porch after a long day, the wind pushing grit across our shoes, there was a kind of quiet you only hear in people who have already fought the fight in their heads and lost it 12 times. I memorized that quiet. It tends to mean more trouble is coming. Even in a town that keeps its opinions neat, there were moments when the mask slipped. Once, on a late Tuesday, I watched Harold pull his Wrangler to the curb outside the diner and leave it idling while he took a call. Beatrice sat in the passenger seat, hands clasped so hard her knuckles went white. She glanced at him like a person glances at a locked door, longing to open it, knowing what waits. I told myself not to read too much into a look. You can make a case out of looks if you're not careful, and most of those cases blow away the second the truth stands up. The town ran on small courtesies, a pie left on a stoop with a note, a bag of nails paid forward at the hardware store, a kid's jump rope stretched across a sidewalk snatched up by a neighbor before anyone tripped. At the center of it all, that cinder block hall Tom helped build 40 years back with a dozen coats of paint and a bulletin board always 2 thumbtacks short. If Cedar Ridge had a heartbeat, you could hear it there. Shuffle of card games, clatter of folding chairs, the way voices soften when someone in the corner starts telling a story you haven't heard in years. Harold had other plans for that building. He made his pitch at a council session packed elbow-to-elbow air heavy with the scent of old wood and hot coffee. I sat along the back wall, notebook in my lap, and watched his tie catch the light. He spoke in a voice that made disagreeing feel like you were embarrassing the room. The older folks shifted wary but polite. The younger ones stared down at their hands. When it ended, Tom stood spine straight and said a few words about his late wife, tracing chalk lines where the stage is. You could see people remember. Harold smiled the way a man smiles when he's planning where the bulldozers will turn first. It was still a safe place, our town, even with all that noise. The sense of order held like a well-made fence gates that swung posts set deep. I knew the names of teenagers who ran loud at midnight, and the color of the blanket Mrs. Peabody draped over her knees on her porch when the temperature dropped below 60. I knew whose porch lights served as beacons for homeward daughters, and which dogs you could scratch behind the ear through a chain-link gap without getting your hand nipped. I kept a ledger in my head of who owed who kindness. It's the only ledger I trust. Some evenings, when the sun slid down and lit the red rock like it had a pilot light of its own, I'd drive out to the overlook and sit for 5 minutes with the engine off. The drop-off beyond the guardrail falls away in layers, stone on stone, time on time. Wind picks up there and carries voices from the picnic area in a way that makes them sound closer than they are. If you stand too close to the edge, you forget how far it is to the bottom. I marked that place on my mental map with a warning. Beautiful, but pay attention. Beatrice came to the courthouse once that spring alone and earlier than office hours. I found her in the hallway with a manila folder clutched against her chest, staring at the door to records, like she could will it to unlock. She didn't see me at first. Her hair was pinned tight, but a few strands had come loose around her ears. She looked tired, real not staged. When I stepped into view, she smoothed her face so fast I almost missed the first one. We exchanged 2 sentences that meant nothing and everything. Then she walked away, heels soft on linoleum folder pressed flat again. I wrote the moment down and underlined the date. Harold called me by my first name when I saw him at the cafe. He always made room for his voice to carry. Detective, he'd say, like a friendly correction. He'd smile over my shoulder to the manager and ask about the muffins as if we were discussing farm prices at a picnic. I could smell cologne that cost more than a decent set of tires, see his eyes flick to the door and back like he was timing who walked in and who didn't. Men like that have a way of making the air feel thin without raising their voices. Town talk gathered in the usual places. I heard it while standing under a tin awning out of a noon sun so bright it made the sidewalk shimmer. Stories about bills that came twice, about a check that never cleared, about a phone call that went cold the second someone asked for a straight answer. I logged what I could prove and let the rest ride alongside it like dust tails behind a truck. You learn to separate noise from signal. You also learn that sometimes the noise has its own truth. The last week before the break, routines lined up on the calendar like paving stones. Maria kept her appointment at the clinic. The note she tucked into her purse that day was a list of questions she never got to ask. Jose fixed an irrigation line on the outskirts of his fields. and stopped by the Feed and Supply to pick up a coil of rope and a new shovel. Tom replaced the worn felt pads under the bingo tables because someone complained about a scratch on the floor that's been there since 1993. My office filled with the paper smell of new filings. I thumbed through a stack by the window and felt the sun travel across my back as the morning turned. That Friday, a bank courier set 2 safe deposit logs on my desk with a cautious look I didn't miss. Paper edges cut a clean line across my palm as I skimmed the entries. The names weren't remarkable. The timing was. It wasn't much, but it tugged at a thread I'd been carrying in my pocket for months. I set the logs down and looked at the clock. Somewhere across town, a windshield caught the light and threw it across a stucco wall like a quiet alarm. Toward the end of that day, I walked Main with a cup of burnt coffee and took stock the way I do when the week changes under my feet. The hardware bell rang. A dog barked twice and settled a kid on a banana seat bike laughed so hard he nearly tipped over. The air had that late afternoon weight to it, warm and fragrant sound carrying long. When I turned the corner by the diner, the wind lifted just enough to bring me a scent I couldn't place cleaner and sharp like a new interior warmed by the sun. 3 blocks away, a silver Jeep idled at a light quiet as an animal waiting to move. Beatrice sat in the passenger seat, looking straight ahead, one hand on the strap of a bag across her lap. Harold leaned into the wheel with the posture of a man laying a claim. The light changed. They rolled on, and the brief shine on the hood slid along the brick storefronts and went soft. I watched their taillights disappear over the rise by the water tower and told myself I'd finish my coffee, file the logs, and call it a day. Behind me, the community center's porch light clicked on early Tom's habit when a storm might roll through even if the sky looked clear. In the sheriff's lot, my phone sat face down on the passenger seat of my cruiser screen, dark. I reached for the door handle and paused, listening to the town breathe. Some nights end with a door closing. That one ended with a light left on too long and a silence that settled in my chest like a warning I couldn't name. Driving home, I passed the community center and saw the porch light still burning against a sky gone the color of iron. The light should have been off by then. Up on the ridge, a pair of headlights crested and vanished, and my phone stayed quiet in the seat beside me. I told myself I'd check on the center first thing in the morning. Then I drove on the road empty for a mile that felt a little longer than usual. By the time the clock on my cruiser touched 11:45, the desert had gone black in every direction. That kind of dark makes its own sound, a hush that hums in your ears. The community center's porch light was still burning behind me, one steady bulb cutting through the night air like a small, stubborn heartbeat. I remember thinking I'd replace that bulb myself next week, but by morning, that promise would feel like it belonged to another life entirely. It started with the call that Harold Winters hadn't shown up to a business meeting. Normally that kind of thing wouldn't raise a single brow in Coconino County, but Harold wasn't the type to skip anything that had his name or money attached to it. His secretary, Janet Walsh, called me before she called his wife. Said his Jeep hadn't been seen around town for days, his phone was going straight to voicemail, and his home security feed was blank, just a frozen frame of the driveway from 3 nights earlier. I promised I'd check in, though my gut was already telling me we were headed into one of those cases that start with a shrug and end in a file you keep open forever. I drove out to their house on the ridge. The gate was open, which I'd never seen before. The driveway glittered with sand and the silver reflection of the moon. Beatrice's SUV sat under the carport spotless, but there was a film of dust on the windshield that told me it hadn't moved in days. When I rang the bell, no one came. The porch smelled faintly of the desert after a hot day, dry stucco, and something sharp like metal baking in the sun. Through the glass, I could see the entryway lights still on, shining over a table laid with mail stacked in neat piles. Everything inside looked too perfect, the kind of order that covers up absence. By midday, word had spread like wildfire through Cedar Ridge. People always pretend they're just concerned when they talk about the Winters, but truth is, curiosity wears a different kind of perfume. The clerk at the diner told me he'd seen them drive off together a week earlier, saying something about a second honeymoon. Others mentioned the Jeep headed north toward the canyon. I called the Grand Canyon Lodge. They said no one by that name had checked in. The desk clerk's tone told me he wasn't surprised. I drove back to the office and logged a missing persons report before the afternoon heat even began to ease. We coordinated with the Park Service that evening. By dawn, a small search team, 2 deputies, 3 rangers, and me was heading toward the outer trails. The air smelled of sagebrush and dust, and the light was so thin it turned the red rock violet. We found their Jeep about 20 miles outside the main visitor center, parked at a narrow trailhead that saw more mule deer than hikers. The vehicle sat at an odd angle, like it had rolled to a stop and never left. The doors were unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. On the passenger seat was Beatrice's purse wallet, lipstick clinic keycard, all untouched. Harold's wallet was on the dash. That detail made the back of my neck prickle. No man like Harold leaves his wallet out in plain view. We started a grid search within minutes. The first thing I saw were the sunglasses, hers lying upside down near the trail entrance, one lens cracked clean through. A few feet beyond that, a crushed water bottle, its plastic streaked with dirt. The ranger found small, dark stains on the rock beside it. When the lab results came back later, they confirmed what I already suspected: human blood. You don't need numbers to know what your gut already whispers. As the hours stretched, the wind picked up moving sand in slow sheets that erased our footprints as we made them. We set up base near the Jeep, marking our search radius with bright orange tape. Every direction looked the same: endless ridges and canyons, folding into one another like a maze built by the earth itself. I watched a helicopter circle overhead, its shadow sweeping across the sandstone like a passing thought. That night, when we regrouped, I sat on the tailgate of my truck boots, powdered in red dust, hands aching from the climb. I thought about Maria Martinez, who had stood on her porch not long ago, telling me through tears how Harold had taken everything from them. There was a part of me that wondered if some rough kind of justice had found him. But another part, the part trained to chase answers, not wishes, knew that justice doesn't wander the desert looking for the guilty. It's dragged there by people like us, inch by inch, until it's found. Day 3 brought new eyes, volunteers, tracking dogs, and a handful of locals who, for all their resentment, still couldn't ignore the mystery of 2 vanished neighbors. The dogs picked up a faint scent heading east, but it dissipated near a cluster of rocks half a mile out. We found torn fabric snagged on a juniper branch, beige and thin like the lining of a jacket. The blood spots continued in small smears, leading nowhere. Every trace stopped just shy of a steep drop-off where the ground gave way to a scatter of shale. The air down there shimmered with heat, and the canyon below looked like it could swallow a secret without leaving a ripple. By the end of the first week, news crews had arrived. Satellite trucks lined the access road, and reporters leaned into microphones as if the desert might whisper them a headline. Cedar Ridge had never seen so many cameras. You could feel the town divide, half of them rooting for a rescue, the other half calling it karma, finally catching up. I kept my voice out of the interviews. I didn't know which truth we were standing closer to yet, and in this job you learn not to mistake silence for peace. That night I drove home with the windows cracked just enough to let in the dry wind. Somewhere between Flagstaff and Cedar Ridge, the radio picked up a faint country song about lost things. I turned it off halfway through. The sound of my own tires felt truer. The investigation widened in the weeks that followed. Financial records, phone logs, surveillance footage, one by one the cracks in their perfect lives came to light. A gas station camera in Flagstaff caught them the morning they vanished. Beatrice's face was turned toward Harold, mouth open, mid-yell, a handful of papers scattering between them. You didn't need audio to hear the fury in it. It played on the screen in the evidence room, silent but loud enough to fill the space between us. I began calling through their contacts, employees, patients, old business partners. Each one offered another layer of deceit. Harold had been dipping into trust funds, insurance accounts, anything with a signature and a decimal point. $3 million missing at least. Beatrice's clinic wasn't clean either. False billing, blackmail rumors, and files sealed tight with non-disclosure agreements. By then, sympathy had dried up entirely. People didn't want a rescue. They wanted a reckoning. Still, the search continued. The Park Service brought in cavers to check old mining shafts and narrow ravines. We found everything but the Winters' rusted tools, animal bones, forgotten camp gear. The desert has a way of holding on to history that's not yours to find. As the days bled into weeks, even the rangers started to look at the canyon differently, as if it had taken something from them too. One evening, I stopped at the overlook again, the same spot I used to clear my head after long shifts. The horizon was a band of orange fading to indigo, and somewhere below, coyotes started calling. I closed my eyes and tried to picture the Winters together, whether they'd walked that trail side by side, or if one had gone ahead knowing exactly what would follow. There's a moment in every disappearance when your belief shifts. It stops being a search for the lost and becomes a search for proof of what your heart already knows. A month later, we scaled back the operation. Officially, the case moved from active search to investigation pending. Unofficially, it meant we were out of ground to cover and air hours to burn. Paperwork replaced hope. We filed reports, boxed evidence, and told the families we'd stay in touch. I drove home that night under a sky so clear it looked hollow. Somewhere, maybe in the dark, between two canyon walls, I imagined a single flashlight beam fading out. Back in town, people tried to move on. The Winters' house went dark except for a motion light that flickered when the wind caught the sensor. The clinic closed within weeks, its windows papered over. At the diner, folks sat in the same booths, talked about weather, and changed the subject whenever the name Winters came up. But I noticed how often they checked the door when it opened, half expecting something or someone to walk through. I kept their file on the top shelf of my cabinet spine facing out. On slow afternoons, I'd take it down, read through my notes, and stare at the photo of the Jeep. The trail behind it looked harmless in daylight, just a cut in the land that led nowhere in particular. But I'd seen too many nowheres swallow lives whole. 3 months later, a dust storm rolled across the county, one of those heavy ones that turns the air orange and makes your teeth feel gritty. When it passed, I drove out to the trailhead again, mostly to prove to myself it was still real. The tape we'd left was gone, scoured away by the wind. The Jeep's tire marks had long vanished, but a piece of orange tape hung caught in a mesquite branch, fluttering like a small flag of surrender. I stood there for a long time, listening to the emptiness echo off the canyon walls. There's a kind of quiet you learn to respect in this line of work. It's not peace, it's distance, the kind that sits between what happened and what you can prove. When I got back in my truck, I noticed something strange. A pair of fresh footprints crossed the soft dirt behind my tires, one set heavier than the other, boot tread deep, heading away from the road and into the scrub. They were too recent to belong to any of us. The ranger I was with swore the trail had been clear when we arrived. We followed the prints for about 20 yards until the ground turned rocky and they disappeared. It might have been nothing, an old hiker, a scavenger, but the sight of them made the hair on my arms rise. That night, back in my kitchen, I poured a cup of coffee I didn't need and looked out across the desert. The sky was empty, the kind of black that swallows sound. In the distance, the ridge line gleamed under moonlight, and for just a moment I could swear I saw a single flicker out there, a reflection, maybe, or something metallic catching the light. It was gone before I could blink. I stood there a long time, the mug cooling in my hands, thinking about that canyon, how it gives nothing freely and takes without warning. The Winters were out there somewhere. Whether buried in the earth or buried in lies, I couldn't yet tell. But I knew this much: in Cedar Ridge, the ground keeps its secrets better than people ever could. And when it finally gives one up, it's never gentle about it. The flicker out on the ridge never left my mind. I tried telling myself it was nothing, just the moon catching rock, maybe a piece of old mining gear glinting in the dark, but I've seen too much in this line of work to ignore a glimmer that doesn't belong. By the time summer settled in over Cedar Ridge, the Winters case had gone from a missing persons file to a ghost story people told at barbecues. You'd hear it in fragments, how they ran off to Mexico, how the canyon swallowed them, how karma finally cashed its check. But every time I walked past that file on the shelf, I felt the same pull I did the first night their Jeep turned up empty. Something about it never settled right. It was the kind of heat that clings to you when the call came in. A gas station in Flagstaff grainy security footage showing a man and woman at the pumps arguing. The timestamp was the same day the Winters left town. The man was red-faced, gesturing hard, and the woman threw what looked like a stack of papers at him before turning away. I leaned closer to the monitor, and there they were, Harold and Beatrice. The footage didn't have sound, but you could almost hear it, that sharp tone couples use when they've run out of forgiveness. It gave us a timeline, and more importantly proof that whatever happened next didn't start in the canyon. It started long before. From that moment, every rock I turned over led to something darker underneath. Harold's business ledgers came in first. What should have been tidy rows of profit and loss was a maze of falsified accounts and fake transfers. We pulled statements that showed retirement funds drained and insurance checks rerouted into dummy corporations. $3 million vanished, give or take. The victims weren't strangers. They were our own Tom Fletcher's widow, the Martinezes. Even the church treasurer who could barely sign her name after a stroke. And Beatrice, she wasn't just looking the other way. She was running her own game, billing insurance companies for treatments that never existed and holding private information over the heads of patients who'd trusted her. The two of them had built an empire on deceit, brick by brick. Still, money crimes don't end in blood at a trailhead. I needed to know who else was in the picture. I spent days in that airless office cross-referencing deposits, phone records, and gas receipts. A pattern started to form like a map drawn in invisible ink. They'd withdrawn large sums in the days before the trip stopped at 3 banks along their route and visited 2 storage units under false names. I drove to both. The one in Flagstaff was empty, smelled like old cardboard and motor oil. The other in Phoenix had a single item inside a broken folding chair. It felt like someone had already cleared their tracks. When the federal agents came in, things sharpened. The FBI assigned Michael Torres out of Phoenix, a man with sharp suits and a sharper mind. He spent 2 weeks digging through the paper trail I'd started, and when he was done, he sat across from me in the break room with a coffee that had gone cold. "He's been doing this for years," he said, laying out folders. Nevada, California, Arizona, different names. Same pattern. Offshore accounts, fake investment firms, shell properties in 3 states. If you mapped it out, Harold's empire looked less like a business and more like a spider web stretching across the Southwest. But webs collapse when the center weakens, and something had cracked between them. I went back to the people who'd known them in those final weeks. Kevin Nash, Harold's old business partner, said he'd never seen him so jumpy. Kept checking his rear view, Kevin told me, like somebody was tailing him. Beatrice's trainer mentioned that she'd started asking strange questions: how to disappear, how long a person could live off-grid. I wrote it all down, then sat back in my chair and tried to picture the drive north. 2 people who built their lives on power, now locked in a car together, each wondering how much the other knew. The deeper I went, the more the town changed around me. People who once crossed the street to avoid the Winters now leaned in close to share their theories. At the grocery store, someone whispered that Beatrice had found out about the stolen money and planned to turn Harold in. At the post office, another said she'd run off with it herself. Most of them agreed on one thing: neither of them deserved to come home. But the law doesn't work on emotion. You find the truth, you follow it, and you let it hurt where it has to. I met Torres at the trailhead in late August, heat bouncing off the rocks like a furnace. We stood by the marker where the Jeep had been found, the same place where the crushed sunglasses still left a faint imprint in the dirt. He pointed east, where the land folded into itself. "We missed something," he said. "They didn't come out here to hike. This was a meeting spot." It made sense. The area was remote, rarely patrolled, and within sight of an old service road that didn't appear on most maps. If they'd arranged a handoff, money documents, whatever it was, the perfect place. We called in another sweep this time, bringing cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. 3 days of searching turned up nothing but the remains of a long-dead mule deer and a rusted shovel half buried in sand. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something human had played out on that ground. Back in Cedar Ridge, the town was fracturing. The Martinezes led a group demanding the county stop spending money on the search, arguing that every dollar was better used helping victims rebuild. I understood their anger. I felt it myself some nights sitting alone in the office long after dark, staring at the wall of evidence that seemed to go nowhere. The Winters had hollowed out more than bank accounts, they'd hollowed out trust. Every neighbor looked at the next wondering who might be lying behind their smile. That fall, the search officially wound down. The park rangers boxed up maps, volunteers went home, and the news crews drifted off in search of fresher tragedies. I stayed behind, still walking the canyon every few weeks. There's a rhythm to that kind of quiet work. The scrape of your boots on rock, the hum of insects, the way sound dies a few feet from your own breath. Once I thought I heard a voice echo off the far wall, a trick of acoustics maybe, but it sent a chill through me. I kept climbing slower now, tracing my hand along the stone. The canyon gives nothing, but every so often you feel it listening. 3 years passed like that cold trail's unanswered letters and silence where their names used to stir anger. Then, one July morning, my phone rang just after dawn. The dispatcher's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "A man just walked into a chevron outside Flagstaff claiming to be Harold Winters." For a moment, I didn't move. It's strange how the human mind can freeze between past and present, how it can take a heartbeat to realize you're standing in both. When I got there, the gas station was already surrounded local police paramedics and a half-circle of reporters smelling blood in the water. They had him inside, sitting on a bench near the soda coolers. He looked like a scarecrow someone had forgotten to put away after Halloween. His clothes hung off him, his skin cracked and dark from sun exposure. He weighed maybe 120 pounds, maybe less. But when I stepped closer, the face beneath all that ruin was unmistakable. Harold Winters. He lifted his head when I said his name, eyes darting like he couldn't believe they were seeing people again. His voice came out hoarse. "I've been trapped," he said. 3 years. Underground." The medics hustled him out before I could ask more. The cameras caught everything, his hollow cheeks, the way his hand trembled when they tried to give him water. For a man who used to walk through this town like he owned it, he looked smaller than I ever thought possible. At the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize him. Malnutrition, dehydration, some signs of trauma. He kept repeating his story in fragments, a cave, a collapse, surviving on rainwater, and insects, Beatrice falling to her death. Every word carried the ring of desperation more than truth. I'd seen survivors of real isolation before, men pulled from mines or lost in the wild for weeks. They had a look of haunted endurance, not this careful performance of it. Still, I let him talk. Sometimes the holes in a story are more revealing than the facts. When they let me in for questioning, he seemed to shrink against the bed. "She fell," he said again. 6 months in. I tried to reach her." He paused, glancing toward his hands, and that's when I noticed it, the faint line on his left ring finger where a tan mark should have been. His wedding ring was gone. I asked about it, and he froze for a fraction too long. Later, when his clothes were logged into evidence, we found it tucked inside a small inner pocket of his jacket. Platinum band blue diamond polished to a shine that didn't match his story of dirt and darkness. I placed it on the tray under the lab light and watched it gleam like something freshly bought. By the time the lab reports came in, the contradictions had piled too high to ignore. His body showed signs of poor nutrition, but not the kind that comes from years of survival. He had dental work, less than a year-old hair trimmed unevenly but clean. I looked through the evidence and felt the shape of the lie forming. Harold hadn't emerged from the ground. He'd been hiding above it. Outside, the town's reaction split down the middle. Some said justice was finally catching up. Others claimed he'd suffered enough. The Martinezes held a sign outside the hospital. "Where is the money? Where is Beatrice?" The crowd grew each day. I watched from across the street the weight of all those eyes pressing against the windows of a place meant for healing. I went home that night and poured myself a glass of water, the kind of ordinary act that suddenly felt heavy. Harold's voice echoed in my head those rehearsed fragments about caves and collapse. The human mind can build walls taller than any canyon, but truth finds its way through cracks. I didn't know yet what he was hiding, but I could feel the direction it was pointing. When the sun came up the next morning, I was already back at my desk. The Winters file lay open, pages curling at the corners, the ring glinting under the fluorescent light. I made a new note in the margin. If it's a lie, it's a practiced one. Then I underlined it twice. Somewhere out there, the real story was waiting, buried not in stone, but in secrets. And I knew deep down that the moment we unearthed it, the whole town of Cedar Ridge would have to face what it had been willing to believe. The ring sat on my desk like a confession glinting under the dull courthouse light. I kept staring at it, thinking about how many times Beatrice had been seen wearing it staff meetings, charity luncheons, even that last town council session when she sat 2 rows behind her husband pretending to be proud of him. It was her trademark. And now, 3 years after both of them vanished, it was polished clean, sitting in a jacket pocket of a man who claimed he'd lived underground all that time. I've handled lies in every shape and size, but that one felt different, slicker, practiced like it had been built piece by piece for an audience. The next morning, I walked into the hospital before sunrise. The halls were quiet, that kind of soft blue light that only happens before the world wakes. Harold was sitting upright in his bed, staring at the wall, an untouched tray of breakfast on the table beside him. The first thing he said was, "Do they believe me?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled the ring from an evidence envelope and set it between us. "Why is this clean?" I asked. He blinked, and for a second I could almost see him searching for the right version of the truth. "She gave it to me," he said finally, voice low, "before she fell. Said to take it to her sister if I made it out." I watched his face steady as I could manage. "She didn't have a sister," I said. And just like that, his eyes shifted sideways, calculating. After that, his story started to unravel. Each time I pressed, he offered a new variation, little inconsistencies that opened into wider gaps. He'd lived on rainwater, he said. Then he mentioned canned food. Later, he claimed he'd found tools in the cave to dig his way out. But the soil under his nails, the soft calluses on his palms, they told a different story. He hadn't been digging through rock. He'd been chopping wood, maybe tending a fire. The medical team backed me up. His blood work showed signs of prolonged malnutrition. Yes, but also protein intake that didn't match starvation. And the dental records, they caught everyone off guard. Recent work. A crown less than a year old. I didn't say much when I read that report. Just closed the folder, took a breath, and realized that Harold hadn't emerged from any cave. He'd walked out of hiding. Outside the hospital, the crowd was growing by the hour. Some held signs demanding justice. Others shouted that he should be left alone. I saw Jose Martinez among them, holding a faded photograph of his old farm, the one Harold had taken from him. His wife, Maria, stood at his side, pale but steady, her hair tucked under a scarf to hide what the chemo had taken. I crossed the street to speak with them. "We just want the truth," Jose said quietly. I nodded because that was all I wanted too, though I knew it would come at a price no one there was ready to pay. Back at the office, I reopened every thread from their final days. There's a rhythm to investigation patient methodical, like combing through the same patch of ground until you finally feel a difference in the dirt. The Winters' financial records showed 3 large cash withdrawals right before their trip. $200,000 total pulled from different branches across 2 cities, both their signatures verified. Beatrice had also accessed a safe deposit box she'd never mentioned to anyone. The contents list was sealed, but the timing told its own story. They hadn't been planning a vacation, they'd been preparing to disappear. A break came from the least likely place. A motel clerk young woman named Sandra called after seeing Harold's face on the news. She remembered him. Said he and Beatrice had checked into her roadside motel under fake names a few days before they supposedly vanished. Paid cash. They fought most of the night, she told me. Loud enough that people complained. I drove out there myself, 2 hours on a sun-bleached highway that shimmered like water. The motel sat between a closed diner and a field of dust. Room 12 still smelled of old smoke and bleach. Sandra walked me through what she'd seen Beatrice loading heavy duffel bags into a red pickup truck around 2 in the morning while Harold watched from the window. He didn't help her, just stood there, jaw tight, arms crossed. I asked if she'd noticed the truck's plate, but she hadn't. The security cameras were broken, just as Harold had probably known. When I stepped outside, I looked toward the edge of the parking lot where desert met asphalt and tried to imagine the sound of that engine pulling away in the dark. Beatrice behind the wheel, finally realizing she was done playing his game. That night, I sat with Torres at the precinct, spreading out photos, receipts, maps across the table. If she was running, he said, tapping the motel timestamp, he found her before she could finish. It fit too neatly to ignore. We drafted a warrant for every remaining property tied to Harold's aliases. Most were empty shells offices that never opened houses that had been sold off years ago, but one stood out. A cabin registered under a false name 15 miles from the canyon trailhead where the Jeep was found. We reached it 2 days later. The path there was rough, no pavement, just packed earth winding through scrub pine. The air smelled of rain and old smoke. When I pushed open the cabin door, the silence inside had weight to it. Dust floated in thin shafts of light from a cracked window. There were signs of life, empty cans stacked neatly by the sink, a small generator blankets that had been recently washed in river water. On the table sat a single open notebook, pages filled with Harold's handwriting. His penmanship had always been distinct, precise, confident, the kind of script men use when they want their words to look unshakable. The entries started out matter-of-fact notes about supplies, weather keeping the generator running. Then the tone shifted. Mentions of betrayal, lines about Beatrice planning to leave and stealing what's mine. The final page was dated 3 days after their disappearance. She won't be taking from anyone again, it read. Now I wait. When they stop looking, I'll start over. I read it twice, then slid it into an evidence bag. Outside, Torres was combing through the brush and called me over. Behind the cabin, buried in the dirt beneath a loose plank, he'd found an old coffee can. Inside it was a cell phone battery removed, wrapped in cloth. Beatrice's. I took it in my hands, felt the cold metal through the fabric. It was like holding her voice before I'd even heard it. The tech team recovered the data within a week. What they found made my stomach tighten. Dozens of recordings, conversations between Harold and Beatrice, some months old, others from the week they vanished. Her voice was clear, sharper than I remembered. She'd been documenting him, gathering evidence of his crimes. The last file stopped me cold. It was dated the very day they disappeared. The recording began mid-argument, her accusing him of stealing money from a charity account, his tone dismissive, cruel. "Those people trusted us," she said, her voice trembling, "and you used them to cover your gambling debts." Harold laughed. That sound, it was the same I'd heard in council chambers when he mocked a man who'd lost his home. "You think you're innocent?" he sneered. You move the money too. You're no better. The fight escalated, overlapping voices. The scrape of movement. Then Beatrice shouting, I'm calling the detective tomorrow. I'm done. After that came silence, a grunt, a thud, and something heavy being dragged across stone. The recording ended there. When I played it for him in the interview room, he didn't even try to pretend shock. Just slumped back in his chair, eyes dull. She was going to destroy everything he said, quietly. I built that life. She wanted to throw it away. There was no remorse in it, just exhaustion, like a man finally unburdening a story he'd rehearsed too many times. He led us to where he'd buried her 2 miles from the trailhead down a ravine littered with sun-bleached branches and scrub. We found her under 3 feet of packed soil, still wearing the jewelry Harold once claimed had been lost in some imaginary cave. The dry air had preserved her better than I expected. Time hadn't softened what he'd done. The coroner said the injury was blunt force trauma, a rock most likely the one found nearby. Its surface darkened where it struck. That night I sat alone in my car, long after everyone else had left the scene. The wind pushed through the canyon, whispering through the grass. I thought about all the lies that had led us here, the fake bank accounts, the false smiles, the story about caves and survival. Harold hadn't been trapped in the dark all that time. He'd built his own prison, one lie at a time, and then convinced himself it was shelter. When I finally started the engine, the headlights caught the edge of the trail, lighting the pale earth where her body had been. I couldn't shake the image. Beatrice had been part of the harm, once complicit in more ways than one, but in the end she tried to make it right. She'd paid the price for seeing too late what kind of man she was married to. Back at the precinct, I signed off the report and looked at the ring one last time. I thought about what it meant when I first found it, how it had felt like a riddle. Now I understood. It wasn't a symbol of love or loss. It was proof of vanity of control. The one thing he'd kept clean through it all. Outside, the sun was rising over Cedar Ridge, the sky washed in pale gold. People were starting to stir, opening storefronts, sweeping porches, trying to live in a town that had spent years under his shadow. The courthouse bell rang out 7 slow chimes, each one fading into the next. By the time the last echo disappeared, I knew the hard part was coming. The arrest, the trial, the faces of every person who'd ever been fooled by him filling the courtroom. Justice was close, but it never feels like victory. It's just the sound of the truth finally making its way up through the dirt. And in that stillness before the day began, I found myself staring out across the desert, wondering if Harold had any idea what his lies had taken from this place, or if men like him ever really understand what they destroy when the truth finally steps into daylight. The morning we brought Harold Winters into custody, the sky was the color of unpolished metal, flat gray and heavy with the promise of rain. The courthouse steps were slick with dew, and the crowd that had gathered was silent in a way I hadn't heard since the search ended 3 years earlier. People watched from behind barricades, no shouting, no jeers, just that long collective stare reserved for the moment when evil finally stops pretending it's misunderstood. Harold walked between 2 deputies. Wrists cuffed, shoulders bent, the collar of his county-issued jumpsuit brushing against his jaw. He didn't look at anyone, not even me. When he passed, I caught a faint smell of cedar smoke and damp wool proof he'd lived off the grid, surviving not by strength but by stubbornness. For years he'd fed on lies, and now the truth was all that was left for him to choke on. The trial came fast, at least by our small-town standards. State prosecutors took the lead on the murder charge. The financial crimes stretched across so many jurisdictions that the federal court joined in. For 2 months, Cedar Ridge filled with out-of-town reporters and lawyers who pronounced the name of our county like they were reading it off a map for the first time. I sat in the front row of the courtroom most days, not because I had to, but because I'd promised myself I would. After all the years of silence, someone needed to see it through from the first gavel to the last. Harold didn't take the stand. His attorney tried to paint him as a desperate man betrayed by his wife, driven to madness by greed and guilt. But Beatrice's recordings left no room for sympathy. When the prosecution played that final one, the scrape of her voice, the struggle, the sound of something heavy dragging over rock, you could feel the air thicken. People who'd lost their savings, their homes, their health because of the Winters, sat frozen eyes, wet hands clasped tight. Maria Martinez wept quietly into a handkerchief while her husband held her shoulder. Even the judge seemed to take a moment before speaking again. The jury was gone less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, embezzlement, wire fraud, and obstruction. Life without parole. The words hung in the air like they'd been waiting for years to be spoken aloud. Harold didn't flinch when the verdict was read. He just lowered his head, lips moving silently, maybe in prayer, maybe in denial. I never found out which. When deputies led him away, a small ripple of applause rose from the back of the room, hesitant at first, then fading when the judge rapped his gavel. Justice, when it finally comes, never feels like celebration. It feels like exhaustion with a pulse. In the weeks that followed, the state and federal restitution fund processed the recovered money, nearly $2 million, found in Harold's hidden accounts and the sale of the cabin. The Martinez family got their farm back. The deed was handed to them in a small ceremony outside the courthouse. Maria was in remission by then, her scarf traded for a wide-brimmed hat. She pressed my hand afterward and said, "You gave us back our land, but more than that, you gave us peace." I didn't know what to say. Sometimes in this job, silence is the truest answer. Beatrice was buried in a quiet plot overlooking the edge of town, a small headstone etched with her name and nothing else. The town council voted to rename the old community center in her honor, not because she was a hero, but because of what she'd tried to do at the end. The Beatrice Winters Memorial Center opened on a cool spring afternoon, the same hall Harold once planned to bulldoze for condos. It felt fitting, a kind of quiet reclamation. The laughter of children echoed through the freshly painted halls that day, and I stood in the doorway watching the sunlight spill across the floorboards. You could almost forget how close this town had come to losing its soul. For me, the aftermath came slower. Some nights I'd wake up thinking about that canyon, the way the wind moved through the ravine, the exact spot where we found her, the faint smell of rain before dawn. Other nights it was Harold's face that stayed with me, not the monster people imagined, but the small, hollow man who believed he could outrun his own deeds. People like that never understand the difference between freedom and hiding. They think distance erases guilt, but all it does is make the silence louder. Torres transferred back to Phoenix a few months later. We kept in touch for a while, occasional calls, trading updates about paperwork or court hearings. Before he left, he stopped by my office, leaned against the doorway, and said, "You know, some stories don't end. They just stop being told. I've thought about that a lot since." He's right. Every case leaves a residue. You can file it, box it, even lock it away, but it never really goes silent. It just waits for you in the still moments when the phone isn't ringing and the desert wind slips under the door. Life in Cedar Ridge found its rhythm again, though it moved slower now. People started showing up at council meetings again. The diner put back the old photographs Harold once demanded they take down, pictures of farmers, miners, teachers, the folks who built the town before money started speaking louder than conscience. You could feel something healing, even if it was uneven, even if some wounds stayed raw. Every spring, the community center hosts a fundraiser for victims of financial crimes. The first year, the crowd was small, maybe 24 people, a tray of sandwiches, a pot of coffee that tasted burnt no matter who made it. But it grew. Now people come from neighboring towns, sharing stories that sound too familiar. I never take the microphone at those events. I just stand by the back wall listening. It's not my story anymore. It belongs to everyone who lived through it, everyone who refused to let it define them. The last time I visited the canyon was late fall. the air cool enough to taste the pine. I parked near the old trailhead where the Jeep had once sat, its keys still in the ignition. The ground there is quiet now, no signs of the chaos that once filled those red rocks. I walked to the edge and looked down into the ravine where we found her. Time had softened it. Wildflowers, a few new saplings. But you can still see the faint depression in the soil where the wind hasn't quite leveled the earth. I stood there a long while, thinking about how two people could have so much and lose everything chasing more. When I turned to leave, the sun was setting behind the ridge, laying long shadows across the canyon floor. The light caught something near a cluster of stones, a shard of glass maybe, or metal, shining faintly before the darkness swallowed it. I didn't walk closer. Some things you leave where they lie. These days I keep a small box on the corner of my desk. Inside is a single photograph, the old community center, before the renovation paint, peeling Tom Fletcher sweeping dust from the front steps, smiling that tired, easy smile of someone who never asked for much. It reminds me why we do this work, not for the headlines, not even for justice in its cleanest form, but for the chance to bring back a little balance to a world that leans too easily toward cruelty. When people ask if I ever regret spending so many years chasing one family's lies, I tell them no. Because truth, when you finally reach it, has weight. It's not light or forgiving. It's heavy solid like the earth we turned that morning in the canyon. It anchors you even when everything else starts to drift. Harold Winters died 3 years into his sentence. The warden called me personally. Heart failure, he said. Peaceful. I hung up and stared at the receiver for a long time, feeling nothing I could name. Peaceful wasn't a word I'd ever use for a man like him. But death evens things out in its own quiet way. The restitution fund still sends checks to victims every quarter. Maria keeps a small framed copy of her deed in the living room. The Martinez farm is green again, rows of crops stretching toward the horizon. Proof that something can grow back after ruin if you tend it long enough. Sometimes, on evenings when the wind carries the smell of rain from the high country, I walk past the community center. The windows glow with soft light and laughter spills out into the street. There's a plaque near the door that reads, "Dedicated to all those who believed in forgiveness but never stopped asking for truth." I think about Beatrice when I see it. How she waited too long to do the right thing but did it anyway. How courage doesn't always look like heroism. Sometimes it's just a single act done too late to save yourself, but soon enough to save someone else. And I think about Cedar Ridge, how it survived, not because we forgot, but because we remembered. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Somewhere out there, another quiet town is waiting to learn what happens when power goes unchecked, and how truth, no matter how buried, always finds its way back to the light.